animal's life is at conception or even implantation of that embryos all the way to those 24 months when the animal calf and actually it starts its productive life. And one thing that I will not do today, and I think everyone like the obvious side of what is a cow that is ready or a cow that we want on our system is that is a healthy cow, a cow that has the right teeth placement, a great udder, that is not lame, that does well on our system, and especially performs at the level that we hope. What I will try to do today is to discuss the behavioral side, right? Like VMS ready cow that is behaviorally set or behaviorally adapt to live on our environment. And I'll try to hit in this very short time 3 of the big points that I think really influence the success and the performance of these animals in this highly complex system. The first one is that we really need an adaptable cow that will thrive in this system that requires them to, well, overcome those challenges or to cope with that challenge of a diverse environment, a motivated cow, especially to milk, that has the right personality. And I'll try to go through that a little bit, and especially a cow with high level of agency, and that agency of like that understand and increase the independent capability of acting, and especially here on milking, right? Because that's what we are providing them, the ability to have agency over the milking system or the milk environment that they have throughout life. So I will try and say this is a photo, of course, discussing is that of VMS ready cow, right? That it struggles with technology, struggle with their own obvious. This is just an illustration of a cow, a funny photo that I got on a farm not too long ago. And the question is like, is that a cow that is ready, right, for our system? Is that a cow that will do, and which type of cows we want? And now we start discuss that adaptable cow, right, that will thrive in that very complex environment. More and more, we have that becoming common on our system. I imagine that everyone that is here is associated with some of these very with systems that have a lot of factors that the cow have to navigate throughout the day, throughout their life, throughout the production cycle. And I make that very classic question, and we have more and more that anecdotal discussion of, is it the calf environment that we need for this cow, a very barren environment that we provide food on our own time and control, that the calf, the heifer, do not have any ability to adapt to any of the systems that we provide them with nutrition, with system. And I will try to talk and show some data showing how the early life environment of this animal actually influence the adaptability level that animal will express throughout their life. And we know that, right? Like we have been discussing that for a few decades now, now it's becoming old. Some of the reviews that we have done looking at what the individual housing of calves influence that animal, making them lower social rank and especially not competitive in highly intensive environments, increase aggressiveness of some of these animals, and especially increase freer response. And I will show some data, but then I will discuss how especially not just the positive side of this animal know what is going on, what that early social environment affect them, but also how this animal deal with other conspecifics in that environment. And I showed this video from Dr. Laura Walling at one of her experiments, showing that it's like not always is a good time for the calf to have a partner in those systems. But there is a lesson that even here, like, you see the white calf is highly motivated to some locomotory play, to interaction with the other calf. And what the other calf is learning here is that relationship that he doesn't have agency sometimes over their coin-specific, right? Like he will hide, he will do things, he will be subject to the behavior of the animals that share that environment with them. For more that he is there, he's hiding, he's getting a very important lesson that sometimes life, it is what it is, and you have to deal with the animals the way you can, and you also have to respond accordingly to it. And we did some of this trial looking like, we keep seeing in other species that the level of adaptability of these animals is highly related to the social environment in early life. And we wanted to test that relationship to these animals, and especially to see if that would go throughout life. And I will show this very classic experiment now that we did almost 10 years ago, comparing the classic system, right? We all have seen calves if you are part of the dairy industry. This is a conventional way that we raise calves early on in life for the first 60 days or so during the pre-weaning period, having them social isolated, especially, hopefully, if they are social isolated, without contact, to prevent some of the disease that will be horizontally transmitted between them. And at that time, we wanted to test the cognitive ability of these animals to be adaptable in the system. And we tested that with the craziest thing that we could think of, the craziest, most complex environment that these calves could be on. We literally raised some of these calves, or 100 of these calves, in a system where at night they had access to the cows. During the day, they were there with other calves in a calf crib between the morning and the afternoon milking. And at night, obviously, they could come in and commingle with the cows in general. If you look closely, they couldn't suckle on those cows, and that was a reason, because we were testing exactly that throughout that time. And at that time, what we did was to train these animals to approach a computer while we were feeding them milk. If this calf was on this training, they would get milk if they approach the right computer screen with the white color, and they would get actually 1 minute a positive punishment, where if they touch the red screen, they would be 1 minute without milk. These calves are very, obviously, very motivated to have milk, and they learned it really well, how to do the system. Oh, my video doesn't want to work, but I will have to explain my video. I changed my computer, where this calf is fantastic. He will touch this little silver box right here, would turn on the computer. You can see that he had done it before, where it touched the screen if it's white. If it's not, it actually retrains itself and doesn't touch the red screen. And it was very easy, actually, to train these calves. If they were in the social housing in 13 sessions, or 2 sessions per day, in a week, these calves would get 100% of the session right. And we found actually no difference between the social housing and the individual housing calves. All calves are like, oh, Joao, this is it, right? You give me the right color, I go there, touch the screen. You give me the wrong color, I wait, and I hope that you are going to give me milk on the next session. And then we went there, and we actually wanted to see how adaptable these animals were if we change the color of this game. If now, instead of giving them the right colors or how we train them, we actually change the game, literally making a crossover, where if the color was that they receive milk, now they would not receive milk and actually receive the punishment of 1 minute without milk. And for 3 sessions, the social house calves were there like, oh my God, what's going on? What is happening? No one needs to be concerned, but we end up actually feeding these calves at the end, the same amount of milk of the session, but they were highly, they vocalize a lot. They were almost coming, looking to you and be like, okay, you just spent all that week pissing me off and making me learn that very, very hard game. And now you're not giving me milk. But you can see that in the same time, actually, they learn the new call. They're very adaptable to the change of the games. And and would happen that they would learn the new color on exactly the same time. Actually, we expected them to spend more time. However, the individual house calves, or the calves that were in that barren environment, were not able, most of them were not able to do so. We repeated this experiment now 3 or 4 times, and that data has been always very reliable, that the adaptability of these animals to change actually become very restricted in this environment. And then I always thought, right, like as a someone into the industry, I was like, oh, I will go around the world. I will go like to countryside Kentucky now and talk about these, and people will be like, oh, but my cows don't play with computer. My calves don't play with computer. Why do we care that they don't learn how to play your stupid game? And we really went and did a lot of trials looking at feed change diets, or feed diets changes. We went and test some other relationship with regrouping, and that data is highly consistent that calves that come from a barren environment actually struggle with changes or being adaptable in a very complex environment. And then the second question that comes is like, what type of contact is actually needed? Do we need to go there and follow up with this very much complex social system where cows and calves have contact, calves in big groups, and we actually test that same game and same hypothesis, like not just comparing individual and group, but actually comparing those calves to the simplest social housing environment that we can provide to them, that is to put calves in pairs. And they actually behave a lot more likely, the group and the cow contact, that they did individually. So this is percent of calves that actually did perform the trial and end up learning the new task. And you can see the great variation that happened, or the great difference that happened between these individual calves in comparison to calves that actually have a complex social environment. And there are many things that plays here. I will just talk 2 of them, but social facilitation, social learning are fundamental on that, like very plastic life period of these animals, right? Like social facilitation being that stimulation of one animal do over the other, where if one calf will go and eat or will go and do something, the other one is learning and is like more likely to do that behavior. And it made us question, right? Is our cows normal? Is our cows that, behave right now, especially when we have 60, 70% of our animals coming from the very barren environment? And we are giving these calves throughout their entire life that many places where we change their life, including now that we're making it very complex. The milking system where they have to go learn the gate is a photo of one of the pasture robot farms that we visit in New Zealand, where the cows had to leave the pasture, come through the gate, get milked, and then go back. And how much adaptability those animals have to have throughout their life, and how much it's impacted by the early life is the question that stays. And that is a lot of anecdotal data. I work with a lot of group housing calves on robot, because many of these farmers have realized that really change their behavior and their adaptability in those systems, depending the raising environment that they are. We are doing some of that research. Don't have a lot of data yet connecting the individual housing all the way to milking, but it's like very likely that effect do happen, and we have a lot of early indications. So the take-home message is that early life socialization or enrichment on the early life period actually promote behavior flexibility and adaptability on these animals. And these animals are less neophobic or less fearful of novel things throughout their life. So what else, right? Like that's it. Early life environment actually influence how these animals are adaptable. But what about the cow itself? What about the individuality of these cows? Especially if you want these cows that will perform a lot of their behavior on their own. So I know that Trevor will talk a lot about that. We'll talk a lot about how personality, temperament of these cows actually influence how they milk, how they use the robot. But we know that in any species, we have 50, 60 years of research, actually a lot of even our own drugs to mental health problems are developed in animals because we know of their individuality, we know what to expect. But we did a lot of trials looking at that personality of calves, and especially if that individuality of these animals would be consistent throughout life. And especially if we can shape the behavior, personality of these animals early on in life, would this effect would be consistent to these animals when they were 30, 60 months, or they will be on our production or our productive part of their life in adulthood. And we did this trial, this actually very interesting trial where we check or we characterize personality trait of these animals when they were calves, post-weaning heifers, and when they were adults to see that consistent through time. And we did the classic test. I don't have the time to really come in details, but we have a lot of standardized tests that actually we can identify some of this personality trait of these animals. And we did that, we compare, and is highly correlated or is highly associated what do you find when these calves are pre-wean and when they are post-wean, when they are heifers and post-wean, and especially when they are heifer and adults. However, and we always joke that was very interesting. A lot, obviously has a lot, and I will talk about the production implication, but it was really funny to us, and especially looking back now of how big COVID impact our lives. We can forever say that one day our research was more important than the COVID outbreak for the Guardian in one of these trials. But more than that, why is it important, right? Why should we care? Why we should care about individuality, personality trait of these animals on our automated milking system, voluntary milk system? We already know, there is a heritability for temperamental to personality trait. There is a lot of that associated to adaptability of these animals to settle into milk throughout life. And we don't have still a very good way to measure it in farm, and we are developing some of that. But the cow's individuality, or the cow's personality trait, really influence how they will relate to some of these factors that we implement in their life. And we are able now, with some of this precision dairy technology, to actually phenotype profiling these animals. We can actually identify some of these animals, and we could do that, and I know that Trevor will discuss how that influences how they milk, the behavior that they have toward the milking system. But can we go there and actually identify the calves that are different, that are more motivated, that are more food motivated, that are less fearful to actually use the system, and how this affect? And we did some of this trial, talk about one of them. We now have a sequence of trial looking at that. Can we go there and actually identify these calves very early on in life, and how could we use this data in some of these very complex systems? And what we did was these calves are very challenged in early life. They have to learn where, how, and what to eat, especially if they are in complex environments like this, where we have the automated feeder that feeds the liquid diet, the concentrate feeder that feeds the grain or the coffee starter, some forage beans, and some water beans. And we got all this data, and could we identify which one of these calves are the one that are less fearful, and especially would use some of this equipment easier toward life, and especially if that would affect performance. And I will not show the data. Obviously, it highly affects performance if the animals use this equipment much easier than others. But the big point here is that calves are highly different between each other, right? We always go around, especially some of these trials, we always talk about the average, the red average, that is pretty much perfect, right? It's like textbook. This calf goes there. When we step them down, start the gradual weaning, they start to eat more grain. They will be eating here at weaning almost 3 kilos of dry matter intake of the starter. Actually, 70% of these calves will be above of the benchmark. But if you look at every line there is a very different history throughout life of these calves, where some of the calves here that I keep saying on my talks that they are the fatty Joaos that go there and start to eat even much prior to winning and will be eating so much on that early on life. But that is like very, like there are calves that really struggle with some of like the feed intake, with using some of this equipment throughout their lives. And why is that? Why is that important? Can we identify these calves? And we really look at the personality difference of these calves, the personality traits difference that we see on these calves. And we did the same test that I talked about, and we found that it's almost obvious. And now we have like a lot of data supporting this, that explorative calves early on in life actually will use the grain sooner, we'll eat more, we'll have greater body intake, and we'll be like, I always like to show this photo of 7032 Fantástico. That is the calf that goes there and was even higher, like it passed the threshold of the scale that we had more than 140 kilos on the 82. So can we identify these calves is the question. Can we tailor management to that? And we did this actually now in various environments in different farms. We did that in Vancouver at UBC. We did that here in Lexington, Kentucky. We did that actually with beef crosses. And we always find the same thing, that fearful calves end up being the ones that has decreased performance, and is related. Personality is highly related, how they will use some of these resources. So can we identify these animals? The question. We did this trial now, looking at that, and we actually using all this data from all this technology very early on in life. In 28 days, we actually are able to divide the calves between the feed-motivated, milk-driven, active calves, and identify these animals even before they go through off this challenge, or even before we have some of these outputs. What to do with this data is still to be developed into our system, but knowing who they are, knowing what happened, and especially this is highly associated with fetching. I'm giving some data that is not published yet, but cows that are not feed motivated are the ones that are more likely to be chronic fetching cows. And that ability that we can use this data, I think, will be fundamental on our future of how we select and we adapt these animals into the system. And the last thing that I want to talk about that I think behaviorally is very fundamental for this cow is the cows that have a high level of agency, or even better, that use that agency or that capability to live on an environment that they control the resources very well. And what do I mean with that, right? Like, obviously, there is a classic relationship here that even the farmers keep saying, or we keep talking about, that we are training these animals to be tech inclined, or animals that are associating food or the reward with system. And that is a classic, like we can make that kind of association that an animal, like early on in life, is learning that if they go somewhere, they find food, and with that, they control that access, will kind of transpose that knowledge for their adult life, that, you know, almost the same system where they go to the robot, will find feed there, and will motivate them to use and to learn how to use that technique, that technology much easier. But I think that is more than that, right? That very complex environment, giving the animals that lesson that they can control their environment is fundamental. And there is this very new paper, right, of looking at that transition from negative to positive with us, but even with the equipment itself. And I'll use that as an example for us to talk about how we can control and adapt the agency of these animals. So this paper look of, can we train heifers actually to do something that normally they will perceive as negative or aversive. So the group at UBC, under the leadership of Dr. Wary, went there and give a positive reinforcement training on heifers to be locked on a headlock and actually to receive an injection throughout life. And I will show the data. My time is running out. But more important than the data, I think, is the video that show, like, if we train the animals to have the agency over their environment, we actually can control their action and can give them that ability to have a positive relationship with here, headlocks and us, but even with the robot or other equipment that we want to use. So if we look at this video, I think everyone here has tried to lock some heifers in the headlock, has tried to give some injection, and this is some of the positive reinforcement heifers, so heifers that were trained that they will get some grain when they lock themselves on the headlock. And I think, like, we all can say that is a very different experience, a very different video than some of the experience that we have trying to lock heifers. And you can see one of them receiving an injection even without the headlock being done. So how can we implement some of this knowledge, some of these techniques in our farms is the question that remain, and especially how we can use that. And I will just make a last point that I think sometimes we don't harvest or don't harness some of these knowledge or some of these techniques that we could be using in some of these more complex farming systems to do so. And we did this trial long ago, very simple, nothing to do, actually completely the opposite than a VMS farm with heifers, that we just wanted, can we pass the knowledge from some cows that know what to do with some of these naive heifers? And we did a very simple trial. We got a lot of heifers. For me as a Brazilian, getting to Canada and seeing heifers that didn't know how to graze was the spark to do this trial. So we got a lot of naive heifers that ever had been outside, had been raised without contact to pasture, and half of them we introduced and habituated them with adult dry cows that knew and had been outside many times. And we test that relationship of, if we put cows outside on pasture with habituated heifers that never had been there, would they graze faster? And we found that actually latency to graze was severely reduced. And more than that, the behavior that they presented when they were introduced to that new environment was also very different. That the cows, the heifers that were naive with experienced animals, vocalized less, jumped less, had a very different relationship with that system. So I think in the future, there is a lot of opportunities. We can use a lot of it to train our animals to give a positive relationship in some of these systems that we create. So my take-home message here, I didn't give any final things that you can do on your farm, but the idea is that we know that individual housing makes, calves and heifers behave differently. We are sometimes just blind to it. And I think there is a lot of interest and a lot of possibilities for us to create more complex environment to these animals. Cows are different, and we should tailor the management and selection program to it. And especially there are a lot of opportunity farms of any size for us to be creative on how we present some of this novelty to these animals and be creative to make sure that we harness the most of these animals in this system. So I'd like to thank, and I will be here on the Q&A after Trevor talk to answer any question you may have. And I would like to thank everyone that is sponsor our program.
Thank you, Joao, for this great presentation. I think everyone that is watching it has a lot of things to think about, because it's a lot of information, but I think it's not just good to see how this could be good for the cow itself, but also interesting to understand how this could be helpful as like safety for farmers that, manage these animals that are more calm and, less afraid on day-to-day basis. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker. First, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Joao, you can still type them on the Q&A box, because we are going to have a Q&A session in the end after Dr. Trevor DeVries' presentation, and we are going to make sure to address all the questions that come in. So moving along with the program, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who will be presenting about cows management and behavior traits in AMS. Dr. Trevor DeVries, thank you very much for being here today. Trevor is a professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Animal Bioscience at the University of Guelph. And in his position, he leads a research program focused on the best practices for nutrition, housing, and management that promote healthy behavior patterns in dairy cattle and are conducive to good health, production, and welfare. I would like to welcome you again. And if you are ready, you can share your screen and the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Camilla. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
And you can hear me well? Perfect.
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invite to be part of this webinar here today with Dr. Costa. I think our topics obviously they fit very well, and what I hope to do is talk about some of the research that we've been doing over the last few years related to this topic area of behavior traits of cows in automated milking systems, and what that means from a management standpoint and also from a selection standpoint, and hopefully we'll kind of round out some of the concepts that Dr. Costa talked about in his presentation. Now, before we talk specifically about behavior traits of cows and how that relates to milking, I think it's good for us to reflect a little bit on why this is important. And again, that was already talked about to some degree in the last presentation. When it comes to automated or robotic milking systems. And often it comes back to it's good to reflect on what benefits robotic milking actually provides to dairy producers. And this is a question we've asked with rapid growth in the industry, particularly in Canada, where I am, over the last 10, 15 years. And was part of actually a study that we did a number of years ago where we surveyed a large proportion of dairy producers at the time who were using robotic milking in Canada to really gauge kind of what benefits that they saw with the adoption of this technology. And we published a series of studies or papers from that study, as cited on the bottom of my slide here. And what we observed across this study and these various papers that we documented was that there was a lot of different benefits, so to speak, that producers reported and we were able to record with the adoption of robotic milking, including greater milking frequency and yield, better cow health and reproduction, greater use and of data and using that for herd management, less and more flexible use of labor, improved profitability and quality of life. And I think some of these things have already been touched on in some of the previous webinars, even as part of this webinar series that's put on this topic area. What was quite interesting in the case of some of these things that we observed is specifically this last question about quality of life. And that's something we delved a little bit deeper into, and we asked producers on a scale of 1 to 5 in the case of this study, whether or not they strongly disagreed or strongly agreed with how robotic milking has changed different aspects of their operation and their life, so to speak. And interestingly, they both for the question of improvements in profitability and met their expectations. It was very positive, but probably the most interesting is actually that they expressed high positivity with the question about their quality of life. And again, they gave lots of good reasons why their quality of life was improved, including labor time being more flexible, having more family time, having more opportunity to or have less kind of physical work and more opportunity to do other things on farm. So all very good things. But probably kind of the most interesting thing is that they rated the change or improvement in the quality of their cows' lives just as important as the quality of their lives. And that kind of then begs the question, what are those benefits for the cows? And again, this is something that, again, there could be quite a bit of variable kind of results, so to speak, for the animal, but probably the first thing that comes to mind is the potential for better health and maybe better production coming out of that, which obviously isn't necessarily better for the animal, but obviously has benefits for the producers in that case. And again, part of that study that we looked at, we asked producers about health-related aspects of their cows, just to gauge again whether or not they saw changes with the adoption of robotic milking or automated milking. And again, this is a summary of some of those responses that we got and some of the data that we put together. And so looking at things like lameness rates, clinical mastitis, somatic cell counts, bacteria counts, conception rates, and culling rates on farm, we asked producers if those things increased, decreased, or stayed the same. And I guess what I'd like to kind of draw your attention to in this table is the fact that for the majority of things, people either basically said they stayed the same, which is kind of would be good. Basically, if you move from one system to the other, nothing really changed there, or things actually got better. And so things like lameness, again, 40% of producers saying that it went down, clinical mastitis, almost 50%, somatic cell count, almost or just over 40% saying that it went down. And then also conception rate improving and culling rate for the majority of cases about the same, and so not much difference there. So what this suggests to us is that there is some potential for, say, better health with the adoption of that technology. Another question that we asked producers kind of on the production side of things is, did they also perceive changes in milk yield and components after transition to robotic milking? And what was interesting is that on the milk component side of things, really for the majority of producers, they did not see a dramatic change. There was a little bit of a higher proportion of producers who did report an increase in, say, milk fat percentage of their milk. But what was interesting is that of those surveyed, over 80% of those indicated that milk yield actually increased, and only a very small proportion of those indicated that it did decrease. And what was interesting in this data set is that this was actually reported changes by the producers. We were able to gain access to those producers' production records and actually verify whether or not those things were, those perceived changes were actually happening as in reality. And this is the results from that analysis. And so we took the actual changes and compared that to the producers' responses. And what's interesting to note is that while there is variability there, and so some producers who thought their milk production increased, it actually decreased. Those who decreased, it did actually decrease. And for those who did not, said it didn't change, there was actually some who increased and some that decreased. Across all these farms, the mean change was actually an improvement in milk production, so about a 440 kilogram milk production change. And so it does speak to the opportunity there for them benefit from that perspective when adopting this technology. It does also suggest to us, both in actual as well as even the perception, that there are opportunities where we don't always see benefits with the adoption of robotic technology. And I'd like to kind of keep that in the back of your minds as we think about then what are some of the challenges that we have with success in robotic milking. And so, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes, that the fact that if we aren't getting cows, say, to milk voluntarily as they should be in those systems, maybe some of these things like extra milk yield that we might gain with voluntary milking might not actually be achieved. The other thing that, again, might come to mind when we think about benefits associated with adoption of robotic milking is more behavioral freedom for cows. And in the fact that, and as Dr. Costa talked about, this idea of agency where we give the animal the opportunity to really choose what they want to do and when. And so in a robotic scenario, the cows can, in an ideal scenario, be able to eat, be able to lie down, be able to drink, as well as be able to milk when they want to, and do so with, again, kind of behavioral agency in that they can do that on their own time. And there is a potential benefit of that. Again, from the affect of the animal, there should be benefit, but then also those things translating into actual potentially benefits from a health and production standpoint as well. Now, kind of flipping that and thinking about that, then some of our challenges when it comes to success in automated milking farms is the fact that when we have situations, say, where maybe the agency of those cows is challenged, or there's other situations where cows do not milk voluntarily. And again, voluntary milking is really a cornerstone of automated or robotic milking type scenarios. And so when we have situations where cows are not doing that voluntarily, then we run into potential challenges. And again, there can be lots of things that have an impact on that, including situations where, say, cows can't milk when they want to. And that would include, say, barn design and management. And again, I know in this webinar series on robotic milking, there's already been presentations and discussion about some of these challenges in terms of how barn design and management may play a role in terms of the success of robotic milking. And again, that's something that we've looked into fairly extensively in a number of different field studies and even controlled studies over the last number of years. And so just again, 4 studies that I've cited here, whereby we've looked at some of these factors, including, say, traffic and barn layout, so free versus guided type systems, the influence that has on, say, milking behavior of cows, things like stocking density, and again, not too surprisingly, just like in conventional systems, when we overcrowd robots, when we overcrowd stalls or feed bunks, it has negative implications on the behavior of the cows, as well as the health and production of those animals. And then feeding management also plays a big role there as well, in terms of either stimulating or potentially even inhibiting, say, voluntary milking, both feeding management at the robot itself. And again, that's been a discussion as part of this webinar series, but also feeding management at the feed bunk, which actually probably has as big, or if not even a bigger role in terms of stimulating voluntary milking in these systems. The other kind of factor or situation where we have kind of an inhibition, so to speak, on voluntary milking is situations where cows do not want to go milk. And so again, there's management factors, housing factors that may limit that, but then there's also situations where the cows themselves might not have that motivation to be milked or go to the robotic milker in an automated system. And health can play a very significant role in that. Obviously, poor health in general, or clinical disease in general, may change the behavioral patterns of cows, may make those cows less mobile, less active, and less willing to, say, go to a robotic milking unit. And probably the biggest one that we think about and probably has an impact across the industry is the hoof health of dairy cows in robotic milking systems, and particularly the experience of lameness. And again, lameness is really defined as any kind of abnormality in the gait of the animal, often as a result of, say, a hoof pathology. And if you've got a cow that has some type of hoof pathology whereby she's experiencing pain and she does not feel comfortable when she's walking, that's going to obviously have an impact in terms of her desire to go milk voluntarily. And so again, we've looked at this over the years and demonstrated that, yeah, those cows that, say, have lameness, even mild lameness, where they're just walking with, say, a small gait abnormality, we see that those cows are more likely to be fetched for milking and have more involuntary milkings per day, so to speak, as opposed to, say, those cows that are walking fine or walking soundly. And as a result of that, what we see is that at the end of the day, those cows that are clinically lame or have some gait abnormality milk less frequently per day. And so they aren't milking voluntary as much and overall. And then as a result of that, we see lesser production in those animals as well. And in the case of this study here, we saw about a 1.6 kilogram difference in milk production between kind of sound cows and lame cows in these robotic milking scenarios. And again, that estimate at that time was comparatively to the literature, one of the larger kind of estimates that we see, particularly between cows that are what we consider more mildly or moderately lame versus cows that are or sound in terms of their gait. And so this suggests that the additive kind of impact of lameness on that cow may be even greater, say, in a robotic milking scenario where it's not only affecting that cow physiologically and the pain and the affect impacts that might have, but also just the behavioral kind of impacts in terms of the walking and activity of that animal and her desire to, say, milk voluntarily. The other aspect, and that's kind of where I wanted to get this presentation here to today, and some of the discussion hopefully that we're going to have, is the fact that we also know that we have behavioral individuality in terms of cows, and we often describe that as personality, and that was already introduced by Dr. Costa in the previous presentation. And what we know is that, yeah, not every animal behaves the same. And when we talk about personality, we're talking about consistency in behavioral patterns or behavioral traits that we see across time and contexts. And what that often manifests is that then is in different behavioral patterns that we observed. And Dr. Costa provided some examples of, say, calves, and how even early in life we see different eating behavior of those calves, and that can be influenced by, say, that individual behavioral or individuality in those behaviors, and or say the personality traits of those animals. And we start to see some of that too when we look at, say, adult cows. We look at different situations, even scoring animals, say, at a feed bunk, looking at how they eat. We see differences in eating patterns, often related to, say, the social hierarchy or the dominance of those animals. But beyond that, even within, say, those kind of different scales or classes of animals, we'll often see even just individual differences in the behavioral kind of profile or patterns of those animals. And where that can have an impact is specifically in a robotic milking scenario where, again, we would like to see some consistency in terms of their behavior, specifically things like milking patterns and milking frequency, and then our ability even to get that consistency so we can, say, feed cows individually, et cetera, in those systems. And this is where we also see some challenges. And I like to use this graph that actually comes from our university robotic milking system that we computed a few years ago, where we looked at how feed amounts in the robot varied between cows across lactation. And what's interesting in this data set, and this is basically across, this is from a group of cows on a robotic milking scenario in our farm across a full lactation period, where each of these dots represents one cow at 1 day in milk. And on the y-axis here, we have the amount of feed offered in the robot to those cows on a daily basis. And what you can see here is that, yeah, it does follow a little bit of a lactation curve, so to speak. But what was interesting is that the cows were actually on a fixed feeding table, whereby in the first pattern of lactation, they were allocated about 6 kilograms per day. And in the second part, that was reduced down to about 4 kilograms per day. And again, I'm not using this as an example of what we should do, but and we shouldn't actually manage nutrition this way in robots. But what it does show us is that in this case here, there was huge variability around those feed allocations, with some cows achieving the level that we wanted and some cows not achieving that, likely influenced by the fact that they weren't, say, visiting the robot voluntarily as frequently as, say, other animals. And so some of that between animal variation, and even between cow variation, say, from day to day, is going to be influenced by the behavioral patterns of those cows. And some cows are just much more adapt to robotic milking and more voluntarily willing, say, to visit that robot, where other cows may not be. And so this has been a focus of our research in the last couple of years, is trying to identify then how some of that behavioral individuality then influences those cows' behavior at the robot, and in terms of how we feed those cows, and even how those animals, say, adapt to those robotic scenarios. And the way that we've done this, and just wanted to highlight this for a second to get you to think about it, Joao kind of introduced this with calves as well, is to use kind of standardized tests to look for consistency in behavioral responses to different situations. And what we typically use is an open field test or an arena test, whereby we will say, for example, we'll introduce a cow into a novel arena, a space that they're typically not used to, and then score the behavior of those cows in terms of what they do in there. Are they walking around a lot? Are they making a lot of vocalizations? Are they searching around the pen, or do they just stand still? And so what we'll do is we'll put the cow in that scenario, look at what the cow does. Then, after a certain period of time of kind of acclimation to that, then we'll introduce, say, a novel object, in this case here, this pink bin here, and look at what the cow then does in that scenario to see how the cow reacts to that novel object. And again, score that. Does she approach it? Does she interact with it? Or does she stay away from it? And based on that, we can then start to look at or group the behaviors of the cows using different mathematical or modeling techniques to see whether or not those cows are, say, more active, more social, more alert or curious, more explorative, different types of kind of broader behavioral categories that we might apply to those animals, or traits that we might ascribe to those animals. And then lastly as well, we'll also then introduce a novel person and look at how that cow interacts with that novel person. And again, this cow is interacting, as you can see, hopefully in the video. Sometimes cows will approach the person, they'll interact with them. Sometimes that cow will stay away from that animal and show, say, signs of more fearfulness and shyness from that person. And so, again, based on their responses and modeling those behaviors together, we can cluster those together, so to speak, and look at whether or not those animals are more active, are they more bold, or are they more fearful and shy. And so we've done that in a variety of different situations, and then looked at how that then affects the behavior of those cows under different situations related to, say, robotic milking. And this is an example of one study that we did earlier or that was published earlier this year, that was done in the last couple of years, whereby we looked at how, say, these behavioral traits then influenced our ability to feed cows in the robot, and whether or not our feeding strategy was influenced by those behavioral traits. And so what we did is we fed cows in a crossover design, either a low feed allocation in the robot, 3 kilograms per day, and that's the AMS, and that you see here with these blue dots, or a higher feed allocation in the robot of 6 kilograms per day in the red dots. And what you see on the low allocation is that when we compare the actual amount of feed delivered to those cows in the robot, the cows were programmed for 3 kilograms per day, and we look across a range of fearfulness, basically, of the novel human that we would compute from those novel human tests. What we see whereby basically a higher level would be a more fearful animal, we actually see all the animals basically performing the same. And so they're all achieving that 3 kilograms of feed delivery in the robot. Whereby when we put them on the higher feed allocation, we actually see this negative association here, whereby those cows that are less fearful are easily achieving that 6 kilograms per day allocation. However, the ability of those more fearful animals to achieve that level of feed in the robot is much lesser, likely due to the fact that, yeah, those more fearful animals are probably going to be less likely to more voluntarily enter the robot and milk as frequently, and thus achieve the feeding levels, say, that we provide. And so what this kind of tells us is that based on those behavioral profiles of those animals, that might actually influence our ability to, say, precision feed individual cows at different levels of feed, if we don't account for, say, their behavioral profile in those circumstances. Kind of learning this, our next step is in our research was actually then to kind of take a step back and look at, okay, then where is some of this being influenced, and does the personality profile or personality traits of these cows actually influence their ability even to adapt to, say, a robotic milking scenario? And so in another study done by same grad student, Anna Schwanke, she looked at how taking cows that had never been on a robotic milking system before in mid-lactation and putting them on a robotic milking system and training them to use that system, how that personality of those cows actually influenced their adaptability. And what Anna found was that say more active cows, so cows that were more active as a result of those tests that we did on those animals, they actually demonstrated kind of more difficulty in adaptation, having less milk yield during their training period, more teat kickoffs during the study. They displayed more sorting of their PMR, and actually at the end of the day, from a health perspective, had a higher somatic cell count. So indicative of kind of a less adaptable and had a bit more difficult time in that robotic scenario. As opposed to that, what Anna found was that those cows that were more bold, so those cows that from a behavioral standpoint, specifically relationship to, say, the novel object and novel person, those animals that were would have been more interactive and demonstrated more of kind of that behavior, those animals actually demonstrated some more beneficial kind of behavior in response to their adaptation to that automated milking system, where from a feeding perspective, we saw less PMR sorting and less variation in PMR consumption and total dry matter intake, and specifically to the robot, we saw less variation in pellet intake as well. And so, which might correspond to a little bit more consistency, say, in their milking behavior in those systems as well. We then followed this up because these were actually mid-lactation cows. We wanted to see, well, what about cows that say we put on the robot at calving, and does that say immediate kind of adaptation to the robotic milking unit at the time of calving have similar, or do we see similar type effects? And so in an even more recent study done by one of my current grad students, Jessica Brazier, what we did was, again, we took cows that had never been on a robot, in this case, both primiparous and multiparous cows, and this result here is just from those multiparous cows, but we looked at, again, basically different outcomes related to those animals in the time period after calving to see whether or not their behavioral traits were related to their success in kind of adaptation to that robotic milking system. And so what Jessica found was that those cows who were more bold, and so again on a scale of minus to plus here, and this comes from our test of those animals that were more bold actually had greater milk yield than those that were less bold. And so again, some indication that the behavioral profile of those animals was having an influence on their ability to successfully adapt to that robotic milking unit and perform better, particularly in this case in the first 7 days after going on to that robotic unit. Now, the question that was raised in the previous presentation and that we've been looking at and thinking about, and hopefully we can have some discussion about, is where does this personality then come from? Where do these individual traits, behavioral traits then come from, and what opportunity then do we have in terms of influencing that? And again, our previous speaker, Dr. Costa, talked about this, the opportunity for, say, early life experience, socialization, other housing and management experiences, which we know can shape the behavioral patterns and profiles of those animals early on in life. And so whether or not that kind of nurture aspect of those animals can carry over and have a positive influence or an influence at all in terms of their, say, adaptability and use of technology, specifically robotic milking system early on or later on in life. There definitely is that opportunity. Whether or not there's also nature effects there as well. And so how much genetics plays a role in that is another good question that we have in terms of whether or not those animals that say are not only learning some of this early on in life and carrying this over, but how much of this is actually heritable. And again, Dr. Costa talked about that. We know that there's things like milking temperament that are heritable. How much of these behavioral traits are also passed on from generation to generation, and then can we use that in the long run to determine whether or not those animals at a young age might be more, say, adaptable. And again, just some very early data from a study that we did. One of my former grad students did a study looking at cows that had been behavioral profiled and who had been adapted to a robotic milking system actually in the previous study, and then looked at the heifer calves of those cows. And what my student Sabina found was that those cows who were more active prior to parturition, as part of the profiling that we had done on those animals, had heifer calves that were also more exploratory active. And you can see this positive relationship here by the basically between the dams activeness score as well as the heifer calves that were born from them, their activeness score as well. This positive relationship here. Again, not explaining all the variation, about 16% of the variability in the heifer scores being explained by the dam scores. But if we think about, again, some of these heritabilities that Dr. Costa showed in the range there, it falls generally kind of closely in line with what we might expect from a behavioral kind of heritability perspective. And so again, moving this forward, we're just kind of scratching the surface here, but we need to think about that there might be opportunities specifically with genomics and being able to key in on some of these genetics and whether or not we can actually select for some of these behavioral traits and do a better job in terms of coming up with animals that might be more, say, beneficial for use of technology and specifically for use of automated milking. And so that gets me to the end of my presentation here today. As summarized, automatic milking presents many opportunities for dairy producers. However, we still have challenges with that, including cow behavior. Some of that's barn design, management, cow health related, as I discussed. But we also have some opportunity when it comes to the kind of individual behavioral profile of cows. And again, whether or not we can shape that, whether or not we can do that through nurture, but also through nature and genetics, we're just starting to kind of work on and scratch the surface on, but I think we have huge potential there. So with that, again, I'd like to thank the various funders that made a lot of this work possible that I described here today. I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion that we might have.
Thank you, Dr. DeVries, for the great presentation. I'm sure that our attendees have a lot to think about. The AMS is relatively new, and we know that. We learn daily about it, and understanding how the cows interact and how the cow's behavior changes with the system, I think will help a lot to improve the management and selecting the best animals for the systems.